Good morning to everyone. Oh, I'm going to shift my screen one more time. Here we go. Good morning to everyone. Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. I feel like I need to say every week now, and I have coffee because the green juice occasionally finds its way in, and it's just not the same, or at least for my nervous system, it's just not the same. We are going to be talking about splintering parties today. I wonder why, but before we plunge into that, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and we are delighted to be with you today. We're going to have a really interesting talk. I know a lot of people are going to want to hear this one, but feel free to chat away. But if you have a question that has something to do with this week's topic, that's going to go down below in the Q&A box. I'll be back in about 30 minutes and we will look at your questions.
Wonderful. And I will add to that, that if you are here for the first time, or maybe the second time, if you're new to History Matters, please let folks know in the chat box, because you will get a robust welcome from the History Matters community, which is indeed a community. And now, Carolee, I've already forgotten, is it episode 187? Is that what you just told me? Thank you. Okay. I in a nanosecond, I forget that. This is our 187th episode. But please do tell us if you're new. In 187 episodes, we've created quite a community. Okay. So I want to talk about splintering parties. I wonder why. There are many things I could have talked about this week, although I semi-recently talked about the Speaker of the House, so I didn't want to go and repeat that. I semi-recently talked about threats and any number of other things that appear to be floating through our political news in the recent past. In the course of rummaging around and deciding what I wanted to say this morning, I did stumble across an article, I don't even remember now which newspaper it was from, in which an ally of Kevin McCarthy in Congress said about one of the meetings that they were having to try and figure out what to do about the Speaker. He said something along the lines of, if we had continued on in the evening in that meeting, there would have been fists thrown. There's a lot of raw emotion here. Of course, my field of blood congressional violence antenna went up. And the first thing that I thought was, well, actually, any evening session in Congress often goes badly. But at any rate, I'm not talking about any of that. I want to talk about splintering parties, obviously, because what we watched, this whole ongoing, whatever you want to call it, that the Republican Party was going through to try and decide who they would pick as a speaker, highlighted what the party is, or what it had been, or what it was becoming. In one way or another, the Republican Party, such as it is at the moment, was on display. And, you know, I think generally speaking, people have talked about how divided it is and how there's, you know, the MAGA extremist part of it. We could all sit here and come up with any number of other ways in which people have talked about it. But the fact of the matter is, in the end, they united behind one candidate who is extreme in his views. So it is a party divided, but now it is a party united, seemingly. And so that's what I want to talk about. I think, as with so many things in American history, and particularly with things that have happened, say, in the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years, we assume things to be a norm or not to be a norm, right? Something happens like what we're seeing now, and we think, wow, the party is divided. How can this be? As my little advertisement for this episode went on pick your own social media platform, this is certainly not the first time a party has, whatever you want to call it, imploded, divided, exploded, splintered. You pick your favorite word, your favorite verb. But the fact of the matter is, although the United States, in one way or another, tends to have two major political parties, there have been any number of other parties floating through. And I think I may have mentioned this At this point, I'm talking with students and you guys every week, so now I can't remember where I've said anything, but I think I said here about this database, the congressional database, where you can go and just ask for the names of parties over time that represent members of Congress, and you'll see that there's so many, not just 4 or 5 or 6, but many, many, many. And some of those parties that come and go in 1 or 2 elections, we tend to forget them. So my overall point here as we begin is that the United States and American political history has a long history of dividing parties, of splintering parties. And I want to talk a little bit about how that has worked over time, and then a little bit about what that can tell us about the moment that we're in, which in some ways is similar and in some ways is different. And as I started out by saying, it's the contest for the speakership that exposed whatever was and is going on in the Republican Party, that showed how divided they were, and now shows how somehow or other they've united behind this one candidate. That we have been, or we meet writ large, like Americans generally have been thinking of the MAGA component of the Republican Party as the extremists, but what we just saw was other Republicans just sort of buying into what that extreme edge wanted. I will leave you to conclude what that means for the Republican Party, but it certainly is a thing to notice and think about. I think it's highly, I'm not going to say suggestive, meaningful. It's meaningful and worth looking at. And I would say too, you know, one of the things that I thought about this morning in preparing this episode, I thought back to 2020, and that was a presidential election year in which the Republican Party, if you remember, didn't create a platform. They just didn't create one. They kind of said, well, we did it in 2016. We can kind of do the same thing. We don't need to make a new one. And in essence, their platform in 2020 was, we support Donald Trump. And I remembering as a political historian at the time, sort of, you know, what, like that was not something that I would have considered to be normal. That was something that I considered to be alarming. And that was a meaningful moment, because in one way or another, and we can certainly talk about the degree to which parties are serious about their platforms, the degree to which they live up to those platforms once they get into power. But platforms, in essence, a string of policies and aims that a given party is supporting in an election, and hopefully in their upcoming period of power, that's kind of a norm. So a party saying, well, we don't really have a platform, we're not going to prepare one, but support Donald Trump, let me just say that many moons from now, if and when historians look back in this rough period of time, that will be a thing that people will look at and draw conclusions from. Certainly future political historian Joanne Freeman would be all over that fact. So what we have right now, in a sense, and we could talk about this in the Q&A, because I debated this a little bit with myself this morning. In some ways, we have a Republican Party that has united behind this one new speaker who's just given office. On the other hand, there are some Republicans who, like this new speaker, seem to have extreme views about the division between, for example, church and state, and any number of other things that appear to be extreme. Although, as I said all over social media, if you line up behind someone who says those things, then you are supporting those things. So even though people might claim to be moderate Republicans right now, they join in supporting one candidate. And so in essence, they've now lined up behind wherever the Republicans are right now. So over time, let me step away and talk about what I want to talk about today, which is splintering parties. We've seen a party that has been splintering all over the place, and we've been watching it and even occasionally laughing at it. And all kinds of people have been talking about, you know, clown cars and any number of other things. And now, I don't know about you, but I'm not laughing. But at any rate, they united. And And it's certainly not the first time that you've seen this kind of, in general, scrambling or splintering of parties. In fact, if you look over the long haul of American history, it happens in one way or another all the time, not identically, not for similar reasons, not with similar outcomes, but often there are two things that help those moments to come about. And not surprisingly, as soon as I say them, you'll think, of course. Often, in one way or another, they are about an explicit policy, and you'll hear I'll be talking about things like slavery. What to do about slavery was highly divisive, divided up parties, but also they are often related to the personalities of people running for the presidency. So presidential elections, and I suppose you could say sort of one notch down, the speakership of the House, where you have to put one person in a position of power, that tends to, again, not surprisingly, highlight and emphasize or expose a party for what it is, cause divisions to happen because people need to line up behind someone or not. So when you look over the long haul of American history, you see policies often are at the heart of these splintering parties. And often it's a presidential election that brings that divide into the light. Now, I just want to talk about a couple divisions so that you can see how it's this combination of personalities and policies, and sometimes presidential elections that cause these kinds of splintering moments. Not surprisingly, the first splintering moment we have is with one of the first two parties. I don't consider the Federalists and Republicans of the 1790s parties. I'm sure I've said this before. It's generally what I teach at Yale because party implies discipline and organization and networking and a whole bunch of things that did not exist in the 1790s. So I think party has too much baggage as a word, but putting that to one side, you have the Federalist Party or partisan alliance and the Republican partisan alliance. And John Adams is the second president, takes over as president. And then we have the quasi-war, the almost war with France that takes up a large chunk of his presidency. And what to do about that, what to do about relations with the French, whether to negotiate some kind of a deal with them or whether to prepare for war, that becomes the policy issue that really gets people into two camps in the Federalist Party that divides the Federalists up. So you have Adams supporting Federalists, and Adams in his old age said that the thing he was proudest of ever in his life was negotiating peace with France in the quasi-war. And in part, he was proudest of it because he went against a huge chunk of his party who did not want him to do that. That becomes the divisive issue. What helps that splintering along is the fact that you have Adams and the people supporting him in that policy on one side, and then you have Alexander Hamilton and the people supporting him and his desire to get ready for war with France on the other side. So you have two individuals that people can line up behind. That the Federalist Party already on a national level, we could talk about this on another episode, but it already was having some issues with the direction in which American politics was going, which was gradually becoming at least a little bit more democratic minded, small d, and the Federalists were not entirely comfortable going there. So they kind of collapsed on a national level and they keep going on a state level. But at any rate, there you have, one of the first two parties in American politics, and the first period when you have some real divisions over an important foreign policy, the Federalists divide. And they never really fully come together again. As I suggested a moment ago, that's not just because of this issue. They already were marching to a slightly different beat than what the nation was moving towards as a country politically. But still, they divide, they kind of fall apart as a national power. Move ahead a little bit in time, and you have yet another party that's there for a while, has some power for a while, and then divides and collapses, the Whig Party. The Whig Party is created for a while in American politics, just like you had Federalists and Republicans, and you have Democrats and Whigs. And the Whig Party starts out not as a bunch of people coming together with unified policy, but largely it's lots of different segments of people, sort of splinters and factions of people who are united in their shared hatred of Andrew Jackson, who is the main Democrat. So the Whig Party forms as kind of an anti-Jackson party and pulls people together with that. And Jackson doing things like, fighting against the Second Bank of the United States, which is something that the Whigs, the sort of party of development and national power, were not thrilled with that move on the part of Jackson. There are any number of other things that divided those two parties. But the Whigs is formed of splinters, is a party for a while, ends up electing 2 presidential candidates into the presidency. But what divides them, again, is a policy issue. And in their case, it's slavery. It's the question of slavery. And increasingly, you have new states joining the Union. Every time a new state joins the Union, there's a revisiting of policy over slavery, national policy of the balance between free and slave states. And eventually, the Whig Party cannot hold together over that issue, and they divide they splinter into separate parties. Some go to what becomes known as the American Party, which is a kind of nativist, know nothing-ish. Those two things are related, the American Party and know nothings, nativist extreme party. And other Whigs eventually go on to become the Republican Party, which is a more anti-slavery focused party. And we could talk another time about what that means, because even then, the people coming together to form the Republican Party are not joined together in unified feelings about fighting slavery. They're opposed to slavery for all kinds of different reasons. And some have a moral opposition to it, and some just want free labor in the West. So there are all kinds of reasons why people come together, but they come together into a new party, splinters of the old party. And that's really, just look up, even in a textbook, or look up, I haven't done this, but I bet you could go to Wikipedia and look up political parties in the US, and you can see, the Liberty Party, the American Party, all kinds of parties come and go. So the idea that there are always 2 absolute parties and that they don't divide, we shouldn't assume that. That is indeed often the norm, but not always the norm. And to some degree, as with many things, I think, in American politics, we have come to assume a certain norm, and now we're watching the edges of it evolve, and maybe the center of it evolve. But we're watching something going on right now with the Republican Party. One of the things to me that's interesting, and those of you who have been here before will not be surprised when I say this, but one of the interesting things that helps the splintering of parties is technology, right? I've said before that democratic politics is a conversation between the people who have power and the people who've given it to them, politicians and the public, and any technology that shapes that conversation shapes democracy. Now, if you look online and look up some of what people are saying, commenting on the MAGA extremist folk, some of them are saying that technology has helped this greatly, because people like Gates no longer are sort of working their way up committee by committee, rank by rank, getting to know all the right people. They're kind of creating a brand and going viral in one way or another, and then raising money, and flaunting their extremism helps on all of those fronts. So the simple fact that there is a whole media complex that is immediate and really powerful, and information, and that younger politicians are going to be, generally speaking, better at applying that than older. And I'm not going to talk about the sort of right-wing media network that exists. All I'm saying at this point is that the ability to deploy social media in a way that promotes your brand, makes you viral, and thus gives you power. That's some of what we're seeing now as to the extremist Republicans. It's part of why they perform the way they do. It's part of why Marjorie Taylor Greene and others are very loud and very strident and very performance minded, because in this kind of media climate, that helps them, helps their cause. And so they're just playing along with that. Game is the word that comes to mind, but this isn't really a game, but I'll leave that out there. Now, what's interesting about that is when I saw this morning, thought about this morning, thought about how technology is shaping the splintering of the Republican Party, and thought, is there a past period that's been like that? And it suddenly dawned on me that, and I wrote about it a little bit in my book. I did not have time this morning to go back and check on it, but I remember that when Franklin Pierce runs for president, for a while, he is able to run in the North as someone who is opposed to slavery, and in the South as someone who supports slavery. And technology is not necessarily absolutely speedy enough to expose that direct contradictory message, that in that case, he is able to be anything to anyone to get the presidency. So there's an example of technology, or an absence of technology, really allowing a candidate, and thus that candidate's party, to not be forced to take a stand on an issue, and to kind of hold back, as so many people in that period did, and just not want to take a stand at all. You know, the idea of a dough-face, D-O-U-G-H, dough-face Democrat. A dough-face Democrat was a Democrat who just didn't want to talk about slavery, not our issue, Southern issue. It's going to divide the party. Let's just not talk about it. You could play with that some in this system where one presidential candidate could be whatever he needed to be in different regions. And for a while, at least, it works. I think in my book, there's a political cartoon exposing the fact that there's a different guy running in different parts of the country. But still, the overall idea is some of what I'm talking about here, which is usually it's policy in one way or another, or policy-minded things that divide parties. Hatred of Andrew Jackson isn't just hatred of Andrew Jackson. It's what Jackson stands for, Bank of the United States, but still, it's the federalist view of what the nation should be, federalist policies, the quasi-war with France helped to divide the Federalist Party. Usually, it's policy-minded things that begin to pull apart the seams of parties. And then often, it's a presidential election that forces people into camps and exposes splinters. That's what we saw with the contest for speaker. And I think we saw it in a speakership contest versus something else, because the Republican Party is so divided that they couldn't even, for quite some time, unite behind a candidate for speaker. There haven't been that many moments in American history where a party that had the majority were this conflicted about who to give the speakership to. So that really says something. I have no idea, and I'm not even going to try to predict what happens when we move towards the presidential election. But what I do want to say is, in addition to the fact that there's a tradition of splintering parties, and that normally it's policy and presidential elections that help do that, let's look at this current moment, because in a sense, although we could say and sit here and recite a list of things that MAGA Republicans support, we could say, well, they want to reduce the separation of church and state, for example. We could come up with things that they believe, but generally speaking, they're not so much policy-minded as opposition-minded. They're more about pinpointing the enemy and then crushing them. And to some degree, yes, that's what politics is about. But to a greater degree, with this particular group of Republicans in this particular moment, defining one's opposition entirely as un-American others who need to be crushed, that's not normal, like their policy is bad, we should oppose it. That's a different level of opposition that is less system-minded and more opposition minded, if you gather the difference. System minded would be they're against us and we're better and we believe better things, don't vote for them. Opposition minded is these people don't deserve to be here, and so we will destroy them. So right now we're at a point where our politics, or certainly a number of Republicans, seem to believe that, and others appear to have fallen in line behind those that are loudest in having that kind of view. And so, as I say in one way or another at the end of many History Matters episodes, some of what I want to say today is to think about what we're seeing, to not take for granted that there are always two parties, that they're marching along like parties, that they're doing the things that parties do, that there are cohesive policies in one way or another combating each other, that there will be free and fair elections, contests with outcomes in which one party goes up against another party, and the outcome of that contest is accepted. We are at a particular moment when many of those, if not all of those things, are in question. So I suppose I'm urging you to not take parties for granted as parties, to look beyond labels. If someone says to you, the Republican Party wants whatever, think about what they're saying, think about who they're talking about, think about what people are willing to stand behind to get and maintain power. Politics in some way is always about that. But right now, we're at a kind of an extreme moment where it appears to be about maintaining, gaining and maintaining power, period. Not before to keep it, and then ideally in the next contest compete and keep it. But there's a permanency to what's going on now, or a desire for permanency among some people, even a desire for one party rule, which is extremely dangerous to, and that's diplomatic. It's not what I would say normally. I would say something a little stronger, but generally speaking, I suppose what I'm saying, as I often say in one way or another, is please don't take things for granted. Don't take a two-party system for granted. Don't take normal party opposition coming up to elections for granted. Don't take any part of the political party system for granted, or what they are going to do coming up to a presidential election. Do not assume that things are going to proceed along the same way that they have before. Actually watch what's happening. Look beyond labels that are being broadcast to really see what people are doing, how they're lining up, and what that lining up means. And the fact that the Republicans just cohered and voted all of them for this new speaker, regardless of whether some Republicans brand themselves moderates, if they supported this speaker, right now, they're not. So think about the reality of what's going on within both parties. Don't take things for granted. I feel like in the end, if someone, again, in the future, someday looks back to History Matters, one of the things that they will see me saying over and over again is, don't take things for granted. But that's because we're in such a distinctive and dangerous political moment, not the first, but distinctive in its mode of danger, that it really is dangerous for us to take things for granted, including the simple fact of democracy. Okay, I only went 2 minutes over. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to move this box out of the way. Okay, now, oops, and let me open chat. There we go.
Barely saying mug, mug, mug.
Oh, 187 episodes, and I totally would forget the mug every freaking time. I don't know how this is possible.
I chatted for 10 minutes before I switched to everyone.
Let me wipe this off. This is actually going to be a very logical one, and it's one that somebody gave me at the NCHE conference. It's the mug of presidential election.
A great one.
It's a
Yeah.
wonderful mug, and it very much speaks to what I was talking about today. And because some of these slogans, no third term, let well enough alone.
Yep.
Hoover? There's like some great wacky things here. Anyway, it's a great mug. I don't know, whoever, if you are out there watching and you gave this mug, please speak up and acknowledge that you gave it to me. I wish that I remembered all of these things that I don't, as do the wonderful people who give me gifts. Carolee wants to know if the mug spreadsheet is being updated.
I think that's from Jen, the teacher from Chicago, the AP history teacher, Jen. She was there for the live episode, and I'm pretty sure she brought that one for the mug swap and brought you one.
Okay, excellent. It is, I see people going, good mug. It was the perfect one for today. I did not have to struggle, as sometimes I do, to come up with the correct mug. If there are people here who aren't new, that the theory behind this is that for every episode of 187 episodes, I come up with a mug that relates to the theme that I've been talking about. I do not have 187 mugs, but I got more when I appeared at the NCHE conference, and I thus far have been able to convince people that the mugs that I pick are actually on target. I try hard sometimes, but this one's good.
That's a good one. It's a nice size too.
It is actually. It's very satisfying to drink it out.
All right, well, we've got lots of good questions. New name here, Marjorie Fairfield. I don't recall Marjorie being with us before, so welcome, Marjorie. She says, oh, she just wanted to say good morning, and it's wonderful to hear us laughing. So it's been a really heavy week.
It has been a really, really, really heavy week, and it's still heavy. So I've actually, I didn't even think about that. My goal, yes, Cece, my goal was not like, let's be community and make each other feel good, but I'm glad that that's what we're doing in the midst of having actually a good conversation. But yes.
Okay, so our friend Troy says his mind is boggled at the number of procedural issues having to be addressed by the three branches regarding the balance to give or take democracy versus outright dysfunction. He wanted to know, does history provide us with a roadmap for fixing this, or is the process considered that we always have to, I don't know what this term means. He says, fiddly wonky inside baseball. That's a new word. Fiddly wonky inside baseball, that this particular mess that we're in just keeps getting kicked down the street. Like, you know, they keep extending to keep the government open, but they only do it for 60 days and then they have to start all over again. He wanted to know if there was a name for that or a roadmap on how to fix it, or are they going to just keep doing these little short-term kind of things?
Well, I can't answer what they will do, because we're in a moment where I can't say that about most things, nor can most of us. So you tell me, but it feels as though that what that question really is that there are all of these sort of ways in which people deploy rules and regulations to warp things in such a way that they can make their immediate point or get what they immediately want, and that whatever they're doing in that situation is not necessarily useful or helpful. Is that kind of what's underlying that question?
I think that's a piece of it, but I think it's he calls it fiddly wonky inside baseball, but which I love. I'm going to write that down after we hang up. But I think what he's getting at is the way they keep kicking it down the road by just having these short-term, measures, like with the budget to keep the government open. They just keep doing it 60 or 90 days at a time, and then we end up right back where the government's going to shut down. The government's going to shut down, instead of just doing it the right way for the first time.
Well, so the budget in some ways is its own little category. I do think there's has always been, in one way or another, let's see if I'm going to get it right, fidgety wonky insider baseball. Is that it?
Fiddly wonky inside baseball.
Fiddly wonky inside baseball. Yeah, if you think about it, there's a reason why every new house in Congress, when it begins, they create their new rules, right? That there are always ways. It is always the case that how things are done dramatically affects what is done. I can't speak specifically to the budget and why things go the way they go and why they don't go in some different kind of a way. But I think, for better and worse, a small d democratic political system is set up so that people can negotiate, compromise, oppose, the sort of fiddly stuff is part of the working of democracy. And sometimes that works well and you end up with a compromise or a debate that is useful, and sometimes it doesn't and you get a standstill. So that doesn't answer your question, but I think in some way, I suppose what I'm saying is that to some degree in a democratic political system, there's a certain amount of that has to be there. That it reminds me of, and I used this story in the recent past about Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams being together at dinner, and I talked about corruption. It was the episode I talked about corruption, and John Adams says, eliminate the corruption from the British government and it would be the finest government on the face of the earth. And Hamilton said, with the corruption, it's the finest government on the face of the earth. And what he meant was this kind of insider baseball with people doing things for each other that one could brand corruption, that to Hamilton felt like that's how politics, generally speaking, how politics works. It's a very, it's a jaded kind of way of thinking, but there's a reason why when European diplomats came to the United States in this early period, some of them were more eager to treat with Hamilton than with Jefferson, because Hamilton, they thought, engaged in this kind of insider baseball-y, corrupt mode of doing things, and that Jefferson seemingly didn't. So it's not quite corruption that we're talking about here. It's a different kind of conversation. Might be interesting if I put that in the back of my brain, like insider baseball politics and what that means and how you play it. But I can't, in this conversation, I think I'll pause there.
Yeah. Debbie, I think it was brought up, another example of that is what's happening with the military, where that Tuberville just won't let anybody be appointed. And so, and Troy kind of clarified his question further and said, yeah, it's like we're just kind of stuck in this holding pattern and can't get past it. But Dave said history matters, and so does fiddly wonky baseball would make a good mug. So.
I love the fact that every week we come up with at least one new mug idea. At least one. Yeah.
All right. New Grandpa Tim, who's been posting beautiful baby pictures for the last couple of weeks. Grandpa Tim wants to know, do current funding and lobbying schemes, PACs, dark money, Citizens United, etc., in some ways make it harder for a third party to emerge because the funding schemes are so entrenched in the way we do politics?
That's a really good question. And I would say in part, yes. I think money and structure, money and power obviously are joined together in all kinds of ways in our political system. And again, in many apolitical system, even a democratic one. It's an interesting question. I remember, I was thinking about it this morning. I remember my first year in grad school, the second semester of my first year in grad school, the topic came up in our sort of big class. Every first year student had to take this one class together that covered all of American history, the first half, second half. And in the second half, I remember someone saying, why do we only have two parties? Like, why don't we have more than two parties? And there wasn't an absolute answer for that. And I don't think the idea that you're a for or against something is logical, because that's true anywhere, right? That you are for or against something. It's not as though that's a uniquely American thing. Again, that's a separate question, but it's a good one. Why, at the same time that I'm saying don't take things for granted, we do tend to assume a two-party system is the norm, and funding and where it's channeled relies on that in part to have power, right? That Americans assume that's the way that things are going to be. And when people step forward, the Lincoln Party or whatever else people step forward to try and do, they're always seen as spoilers and not as real parties. So it's a really interesting question. In a sense, it's a good political science question, but it is a very good question.
The government teachers are lighting up in the chat for sure on that. All right. Our good buddy Dave asks, for years, Republicans have fundraised and demonized Nancy Pelosi to get money and get out the vote. Are you thinking like me, he's asking, like him, if it would be a good strategy for Democrats to do the same thing with extreme conservative Speaker Mike Johnson. So should they fundraise off, Johnson being scary, and if you don't send us money, he's going to take over?
I mean, whether I think it should or shouldn't happen, it probably will happen. It just depends on who does that. I think there are any number of ways in which people can fundraise, and fundraising is important. It somehow really particularly jarring when people fundraise off of, like, you break a law and you're, indicted for breaking a law, and then you get money off the fact that you've done potentially something bad. Give me money. But generally speaking, using opposition to people, to parties, to political players to raise money, I guess I don't see that as a should or shouldn't. I just see that as a kind of thing that's going to happen. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine Democrats, and again, I'm not defining what I mean by that, but some Democrats not saying, I think probably already, if I looked in my email, they would be there, right? Stepping forward and saying, look what just happened. That we need to do now stuff, right? We need to register voters. We need to, whatever the things are, and that there would be money raising tied up in that. I would be surprised if it didn't happen.
Yeah. Chat is going crazy over there. Dale asks, you made an argument that in the past parties have split decisions on policies, but did they also split on cultural issues as parties are doing today?
Well, policy is a big word. You could say that slavery is a policy issue. It's bound up with a kind of cultural idea of what the South is. And certainly there would have been, for a while in the first half of the 19th century, opposition to many things that were bound together as the South. I think slavery would be at the root of that, but there would be a, Southern society is bad in these ways, kind of a more cultural way, a social cultural way of looking at things. I'm trying to think, well, again, I don't have specifics in mind, but if the question at its base is, have there been other moments when culture war of one kind or another has been part of political contests, I would say yes. The question is, how does that culture war, what does it have to do with broader issues of policy, or is it just a culture war? You know what I mean? Like, a culture war can be a tool towards a larger view of the nation, or culture war can just be what that party is standing for at a given time. Right now, so much of our politics, and particularly on the right, is centered on this culture war, where just throw the word woke around as much as you possibly can as a bad thing, and no one can define it, but you can have woke M&Ms and they're bad. That's, it's being used in a very undefined, amorphous, broad way as just things that we don't like, cultural things that appear to be liberal are bad. And that now has become this culture war. Again, there have been other moments in American history where there have been cultural components to political opposition. This moment in particular, it just feels, again, not necessarily the most extreme in American history, but very extreme in and of itself. And we are watching different things get brought to the foreground of the cultural war, right? Critical race theory, okay, that goes back, woke, and that goes back, and something else will be thrown into the center of things, and people will scream about it, and then there'll be some new thing to scream about found. And that's a sort of convenient cultural gathering point more than anything. That's not policy. It's the opposite of policy, right? We hate woke things. There's no concrete anything in that statement. There's no definition of what woke is. There's no understanding of what woke is. It's just woke equals them. They are bad. We oppose it. It tells you a lot about the logic behind people who are using that kind of cultural warfare as a real cohesive bonding point for a party.
Yeah. Okay. George has a short question. Did George Washington have any type of platform?
I know it's a good question. So the I'm going to be such a historian. Yes and no. No, in that there weren't platforms in the way that we now think of them, where people come to office and they're like, here's what I stand for. And it gets written down, right? And everybody knows what it is. But I would say, and it's the reason why Washington was so unanimously seen as the only guy who could be president at that moment in time. You know, it was assumed he's for holding the Union together. He's for, at least for a time, it was assumed that he's not for monarchy, right? That he's for holding true to whatever the American Revolution stands for. That kind of gets a little less, more questioned by his second term. But generally speaking, I wouldn't say there was a platform, but he certainly stood for things. He was trusted. It was assumed he would be responsible in the way he used power. It was assumed he won a war for the nation and that he would be someone who would stand behind the nation. It was assumed that he would be trying hard not to be a king. Again, that gets questioned within a semi-early moment. So it's more that his platform was kind of who he was supposed to be as leader, I think, more than anything. He tried, to be more of an umpire and not line himself up with one party or another. He was pretty much a Federalist, and after he comes out of the presidency, it becomes clear that he's a Federalist. But I would say that was his, his platform was more about who he felt a president needed to be at this particular moment in time, when it was all important, because that was one of the huge things that was going to differentiate what was going on in the United States versus the monarchies that controlled the rest of the world.
Yeah. All right, we have another new name. At least I don't recall this person being with us before. So Drew Deaver asks, he's wondering if Hunting for Hamilton is still being written, because he has not heard anything about it in a while. And he is curious as it pertains to this topic. Okay.
Yes, it is still being written. It is being written very slowly, I will acknowledge. But yes, it has been contracted. So it exists. Someone has, said, I will pay for that. So it exists. It is being, I see these little, yay. Okay, thank you, enthusiastic person. I'm always a slow writer, and will just openly acknowledge that given the sort of ongoing democratic, small d, like democracy crisis that we're in the middle of, that always is in the foreground for me. And it makes it really hard for me to sit at my desk and muse about something else. That said, the Hunting for Hamilton book, which is really about how Americans think about American history in different ways over time, and I just happen to know Hamilton really well, so he becomes the guy I can use to do that. It is related to now, because it very much is going to be about how we look to the past and to define ourselves in the present and to expose ourselves in the present. So in one way or another, how people have looked at Hamilton and his time and how that's changed over time relates very much to where we are right now. And we haven't talked about it in a few weeks, but talking about what right now people are saying does not count as history or should not count as history, or the way in which even looking at Hamilton, that Hamilton in some way has become, an abolitionist hero, and he wasn't. But there, people want a founder abolitionist hero, and Hamilton, sort of suits that moment, or that he's like the guy who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and he's a guy who doesn't need government handouts. I mean, Hamilton right now is being, cast in all sorts of shapes that have more to do with our parties than anything else. That's the sort of thing, I guess, that I have started writing about and would be looking at over time. And obviously there will be a chapter about the Hamilton musical and the interesting ways in which that says something about us and where we are. And the thing about this book and why it's taking so long is I'm kind of in it. right? It's me who's doing the hunting, and it's not about me, but it's me doing the hunting. And I brilliantly, without thinking about it, cataloged all of my hunting in like 7, 8, 9, 10 spiral notebooks from across the years when I was doing this. So they're sitting back there. So they're, I left myself great primary evidence, but it's a hard thing to do. And it's harder still for me to not be focused on the immediate political crisis right in front of us. It's a longer answer than I needed, but that. Yep.
All right, we've got a lot of new people asking great questions.
Yay!
I know. So this one looks very official. It says Mona Santos, CFP trademark symbol. I didn't even know you could do that in Zoom. So
Wow.
I'm very impressed. Mona's question is, are there examples in our history of broader cross-party coalitions coming together to defeat threats to our democracy? She says, I need something to lean on right now.
Oh gosh. Well, there's certainly, wartime national crises, usually COVID kind of blew that up, but typically, like for a while after 9/11, people came together. Remember, there was that little moment, that brief and shining moment in the steps of the Capitol when all the members of Congress came, and I think they sang the national anthem. Or I can't even remember whether they sang or recited, but there was like a bipartisan moment. There have been moments when there's been a really obvious national crisis that brought people from all different areas together. COVID kind of scrambled expectations on that front. Even that disease became politicized in that way. It's not the first time that happened. Same thing happened in the 1790s over yellow fever, where there was a Republican cure and a Federalist cure. And the politics of which cure you chose for yellow fever was, again, a sort of echoes some of what goes on now and was equally not useful. So yeah, there have been moments when there have been cross-party coalitions. I just, it's highly unsatisfying for me to say this, but I don't feel capable of predicting what's going to come next right now. I kind of don't think it's responsible to do that, because we really don't know. And we should be really watching and thinking about what's happening as it's unfolding. Again, as I've said many, many times, assuming that democracy is safe and that we will always have democracy in America, that's not a safe bet. And to assume it's a safe bet is going to take us off guard at a time when we need to be on guard. So I can't predict or won't predict. And it's a really tense thing to be always kind of in this, maybe. So I guess to Mona, I think, who asked this, have there been other times when people have come together across the aisle at a moment of crisis? Yes. Could it happen again here, depending on what happens? Yes. Will I absolutely predict that it will happen? No. So we are not hopeless. We are not necessarily circling the drain, but we can see the drain. The drain is right there.
We're close.
You're right. And so we need to, this is a moment that requires for us to be alert and active and energized. And we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't assume it's all over. We shouldn't assume that everything will be great in the end, because it always has been. We need to really be aware of what's happening. We need to really look at the realities as opposed to the cover image and the rhetoric being tossed around. And we need to be willing to come forward and speak out and act out. And whether that just means, I was on, who knows where, some social media platform, saying that people should, during the speaker contest, saying that people need to contact their member of Congress and say what they think about what's happening. And a lot of people said, why should I? My member of Congress is a supporter, doesn't support my politics. That's precisely why you need to contact them, right? People, even people who are going to vote and do things that you do not like, they need to be aware of how much opposition there is to what they do. So there's a case in which doesn't take a lot of effort to do, but it would really matter if more of us more frequently actually stepped forward and said, I'm one of your constituents and I hate this. These are people who need support for power, one way or another. They need support for power. And if a lot of constituents step forward and say, you don't have my support, they'll at least hear it. And that's one minor thing that we can do. But we need to be willing to speak up, speak out, step up, and really make ourselves known. I've said this a lot before too, but public opinion matters. It always has in the American Democratic Republic. It does. And the louder the public voice is, the greater the impact it will have. And we should never give up on the very simple fact that that is true. We should never assume it doesn't matter. It matters. And if you look around, you could see again and again and again moments where people spoke up and there's a response, even on the level of scholastic books, saying they're going to have like a special category for LGBTQ and other sorts of books that people can opt out so they don't have to include those kinds of books in scholastic book fairs. A lot of people made a stink, and then Scholastic kind of reeled it back in, right? It's not admirable to see a company like come out with a policy that's miserable and then like, oh, oops, and back up. But you can have an impact by speaking out. So never, ever, ever forget that.
Yeah. Another new name. This one just says Marty M, which sounds very cool. And of course, I thought of Back to the Future. Like
I was going to say Marty McFly, right?
That's where my brain went.
Sorry, Marty, but that was in my brain.
Yeah. Marty M asked, doesn't the electoral college system kind of force us into a two-party system, at least for the president? If no one gets a majority in the electoral college, presidential election falls to the House. That would be kind of scary.
Yeah. So the question is,
doesn't the electoral college kind of set us up for only really a two-party system?
I don't know if I'd say it absolutely sets us up for that. That would be another conversation and a good one as to in what ways are we set up for one or another, multiple party system or a two-party system. But in this conversation, I think I'm not going to veer off into big structural things like that at exactly the time when we're supposed to be moving on to the after party. But it's a really good question, and actually I will I meant to do more rummaging around this morning, and I will do that, and maybe that's another conversation that we can have that will be very relevant for quite some time, which is, why do we have only two parties, and what does that suggest about our political system overall?
All right. Just got a few more. I don't know how many we have time for. We have 4 left. This is Sydney, our favorite student.
Okay.
Sydney says, am I being too optimistic and idealistic to think two main political parties could put aside their differences and work together in harmony? Why or why not? Has it ever happened?
It can happen. I don't think it happens 100%. I don't think everybody comes together and sings Kumbaya and puts aside all party differences. I think there have been moments when people really do reach across the aisle in a sincere, good faith kind of a way and act together. I think a democratic politics is a divided politics. It's supposed to be. You're supposed to have contests, and the public helps decide the contests, and that's the way it works. That said, it's very possible for people with opposing politics to come together and make some kind of deal or compromise. Doesn't always mean that the compromise is good. So someone online said to me, oh yeah, compromise is so great. What about the 3/5 compromise? I said, I didn't say compromises are always good. I just said that the act of compromising is part of the democratic process. So I would say, if you're looking for, can that ever happen? Yes, it can happen. It has happened. I don't think necessarily it's realistic to expect everyone on all sides to all come together and do the same thing. And it doesn't have to happen that way for people to come together and have a good result from what they're doing.
All right. Do you want to squeeze one more in?
Okay.
Tim asks, does the seniority system as it works in Congress also something that hinders the creation of additional parties?
Well, I don't have an absolute answer to that, except that I will refer back to the comment I made about technology, and that there are people who are getting a lot of power and getting great sort of public attention by using social media and other, the sort of Republican media network to promote themselves in a way that raises them above the system that's in place, and kind of shifts it and complicates it. And that's a lot of what we're have been seeing as far as the Republican Party goes in Congress.
All right, there's two more, but it's up to you.
Yeah, well, it's 3 minutes after. What kinds of questions are they? Are they ones that I could answer relatively quickly?
I think this first one is, this is Dave. He says, would we have more political parties if the 1929 law that capped the number of House members at 435, based on the current population, it would be over 1,000 now, right? So did capping it at 435 hinder more political parties, do you think?
I don't have an absolute answer to that. It's possible that that's the case, and that there are fewer, the number is smaller, and that there's just less diversity in party, but I don't absolutely know. I actually will not even try and guess as to that. That's a really good suggestion. I actually don't have an answer. Right now, I don't have an answer. Doesn't mean I won't come back with one, but right now I don't.
Imagine if we had 1,000 members of Congress. We have to do it in like a sports arena, like a football field, just to meet.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. So I think we segue. It's 5 minutes after, and I know some people need to go. So here's what's going to happen now. We are going to segue to the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording what's going on here so that we can be even freer and easier in our conversation. We can talk about whatever we choose to talk about. If you beamed in through NCHE, stay right where you are, and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us right now on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and come to the NCHE website. You need to come to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. Okay, I want to say, there's like so much going on in chat. I'm trying not to look. It's like there's a lot, like capital letters and stuff. At any rate, I do want to thank you all, as ever, for coming and engaging in the conversation of democracy on a weekly basis. It matters. It matters for us, but it matters more broadly that we can have these kinds of conversations about issues that are really important, and that we as a group can kind of awaken each other to the fact that we need to be alert and watching in so many different ways about what's going on right now, and to talk to others about the same. I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. It is possible that I might have to pre-record next week's conversation. I will figure this out and talk to Annie. I'm going to be on the road, and I actually will be in front of an audience at the moment when I know, so I can't do what Annie does and be like, here I am in the hotel. It's like, no, here I am in front of an audience. Anyway, I'll figure that out. But at any rate, everybody have a wonderful week. Thank you for being here and being part of this amazing community. Thank you to Annie and John. And we will now segue to the after party.